Welcome back to Books, Boots, Booze. I am your host, Dylan Thomas Good, and it's time for another rousing edition of BX3. I have my boots, as you can see, and I have my booze, and as always, we have books. I'm sitting here in front of the bookshelf for the first time ever, seeing books I haven't seen for a while yet. So, but I used to have numerous bookcases. I'm trying to smash it down into just one or two or three at the most. But yeah, hopefully no more than three. But this episode is going to be sort of a coda, if you will, on what last month's, it wasn't last week. We've had a COVID-19 thing in the last week, so yeah, things have been a little busy in the last couple of days, but we're going to be focusing this time on poetry because it's a natural outcropping when you're talking about lyrics and songwriting. So we're going to go over this type of crash course in poetry and give you some examples and some similarities between different ones, and I'll even be reading a short passage from my own book, which is called Lanterns in the Windows. So yes, so we'll be getting to that in a little bit, but for now, go ahead, sit back, relax, enjoy your favorite beverage, which today mine is a Zinfandel, and it's not bad. It's actually been better than the last few I had, which were terrible. So sit down, get comfy, and we're going to talk about poetry next, so stick with me. Poetry basically is in one of two camps. It's either rhyming or it's not rhyming. And rhyming verse, which the definition of which is pretty self-explanatory, but a lot of the times it is based on something called iambic pentameter, which is this sort of, in layman's terms, it's a series of stressed and unstressed syllables, usually 10 syllables in length. And it gives a poem its flow, its cadence, if you will. Now, the other side of the coin is the unrhyming poetry. And this sort of comes in two different things. You have the ones that do have flow. They don't rhyme, but they have flow. And that's called blank verse. And that's basically the same type of thing as I just mentioned with rhyming poetry, although it, of course, doesn't rhyme. But there's also something called free verse, and that's become much more popular in the 20th and 21st centuries. And that has a lot to do with absolute independence, and no structure, no format, no pentameter, no flow. It's all just freewheeling and crazy. So there's been a big call for that, because as academia has come to stress rhyming and schemes and all these things that I'll be getting to in a bit, free verse allows people a little bit more room to expand their horizons and express themselves. And so it's become a much more prevalent form of art, as opposed to, Shakespeare's time or during Victorian times or anything like that, where there was a big explosion of poetic license, so to speak. And much like how I said on the last episode that music is its own language, and it parallels with poetry, and one of the premier examples of that is a ballad. We've all heard of a ballad, and it's usually in terms of music, but it's actually of a poetic origin. And a ballad, of course, is one of those things that can be both a poem or a song. And I think that's a great place to start, considering what we just talked about last month on the last episode of BX3, where we talked about music and lyrics and how those are structured and provide form, and all the necessary functions that lyrics have, not only in modern music, but also in the music that is made up forms that have come before that. You know, I mean, you look at stuff out now, you know, basically it's all, you know, disco and blues based, you know, so it's all stuff from basically the last 75 years. But, you know, needless to say, songs lasted way more way more than 75 years now. So there are many other examples of that lead up to it. The ballad is, of course, something that emphasizes melody and rhyme, and it's usually made up of quatrains. Quatrains, if you look at an album lyric sheet, you'll notice that a lot of the lyrics for a song, or a ballad in this case, have 4 lines, and then 4 lines, and 4 lines, and 4 lines. Even choruses of songs can blend with that quatrain. Quatrain meaning 4. There's also threes and mixes of 3s and 4s. We'll get to that in a few minutes. But a lot of the times quatrains have to deal with alternating rhyme schemes. So you got an A-B type of thing, or, you know, an AABB or something to that effect. But the ballad is also very similar to what in poetic parlance is called a lyric. And that is very similar to the ballad, but it has more of an emphasis on emotions, feelings, emotive qualities. And its prime raison d'etre, and I hate sounding so absolutely pretentious there, but its reason for being is for emotional conveyance rather than melody, whereas the ballad relies on melody. Ballads and lyrics are shorter forms, and I'm sure you're wondering, well, Mr. Good, what about long form? And the big version of that is an epic. An epic is a long form, and it usually deals with some kind of massive undertaking, usually historical in construct, and it has very serious and at times portentous themes. Portentous, not pretentious. Portentous themes that have to deal with Greek mythology or things of that nature, where it's a hero has a quest, you know, that has to do a lot with epics. Epics are very similar to a narrative. A narrative is not quite as big in form as an epic, but it does tell a story. It may not be, you know, feats of strength and mythological creatures or anything like that, but it does have a story kind of quality to it. A narrative also could be used in music, you know, because we have a lot of story songs. Unfortunately, we just lost this past week Kenny Rogers, and he had a great storytelling song called Coward of the County. And so that's a narrative because it tells a story. And so you could apply that to both sides of the coin. It could be either poem or it could be song, and you know, lyrics to a song. And so a lot of things, as we see here, are very fluid between the world of poetry and the world of songwriting. Our next 2 examples of poetry are very similar but have different purposes. The first one is called Node, and that one is, for whatever reason, out of all these examples, one of the ones that is much more attuned with songwriting now than it is with poetry, which is its natural origin. In years past, we've had things like Ode to Joy, you know, Beethoven, and back in the 60s, there was a song called Ode to Billy Joe. Remember that one by Billy Gentry? I don't remember that. That was before I was born. Not that fucking old. But ode basically just pays tribute to something or someone. And on the other side of that coin, though, there is something called the elegy. And the elegy is something that pays tribute to someone that has passed. Who has passed? Not that has passed. Got to get my pronouns right here. And its main themes have to do with loss, death, mourning, transition, all these things that we feel when we lose something very, very dear to us. The last example in this section is pastoral poetry, and as its name implies, it has to do with nature, and its main focus is nature and man's relationship with nature. In my first poetry book, Lanterns in the Windows, I wrote a poem, actually it was the first one in the book, called Cymru, He Said. And Cymru, of course, is the Welsh word for Wales. And it has to do with the phasing out of the Welsh language. And I likened that to a storm out in nature, and about how a grandson was being held by his grandfather and being taken through this storm. And I equated that with the Welsh language and how, we sort of needed to keep it alive. So, as you may have guessed, I'm going to go ahead and read you Cymru, He Said. So, get ready. The statistic that I saw that led to the writing of this was that only 1 in 6 Welshmen can actually speak Welsh now. So, without further ado, this is Cymru, He Said. Cymru, the grandfather said, pointing with directions outstretched above his tiny grandson's yawn, unclamped his pipe from his teeth and teetered it aside, turning the boy to see nature in its most unadulterated form. The grandson babe shivered against nature's raw disposition, regardless of its colors and righteous intentions. The grandfather shivered also, perturbed. When the boy grows up, will we be able to understand one another? His old fingers moved faster than the flaw, hooding the babe's face. Holyhead was freezing, and it was coming their way. He clenched his pipe back into his teeth, grinding ivory as he delivered the boy off, fighting, running as quick as a patriarch could. Dread mists upon the mountain, adjacent to the form, stood atop. You cannot confound nature nor its deliverance unto us. Winter Dome drove forth as he smiled, held the boy up, tempting the thunder everywhere. Cymru, he said. And so that is an example of pastoral poetry. And like I said, there's a lot of poetry that has to do with nature. And one of our first examples here in the second half of the show, which will deal with metered poetry, is the very famous form of haiku. Now, haiku is, needless to say, of Japanese origin, and my first introduction to poetry was haiku in about, grade 4. And we're going back like almost 40 years here, so I'm not quite sure, but as you know, haiku has a specific beat to it. And in haiku, you've got 5 syllables, 7 syllables, and 5 syllables again. And much like pastoral poetry, haiku has its basis in nature. A lot of the original Japanese or traditional Japanese poetry has to do with nature. So, and a lot of it is very, very beautiful, and it's not something that you have to invest a lot of time in. It's something that's almost like an instant gratification type of poetry. It's very short. It's probably the shortest one of any of the ones that we're going to mention here on the program. So I won't go into gigantic explanations about haiku, but definitely check it out because, like I said, it's got a very zen quality. It's very relaxed, and it has a lot of merit, and it has a lot of influence on many other different types of poetry. So go and check that out too. Next on our list of poetry with specific beats or lines is something called the villanelle. It consists of 19 lines, and it's a mix of tercets, which, remember I said about quatrains, which are 4 lines. Tercets have 3 lines, and the villanelle is a mix of both. It usually starts with, I believe, a few of the 3-line sections, and then goes into a 4 section, and then a couple more 3 lines, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's how it is. But probably the biggest example of that is "Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night" by that guy who has a name very similar to mine. So definitely go. That's absolutely required reading. So go and read it. And I'm not just saying that because the guy has the same name as I do. The next format we're going to look at is sonnet, and it's similar to a villanelle, but it actually only consists of 14 lines rather than 19. And a sonnet, for all you people who've read Shakespeare, has to do with love, and very similar to numerous other ones that we've talked about, ballads and lyrics and things like that. Sonnets are very, very emotionally based. Sonnets' claim to fame, I'm not going to lie, is Shakespeare. And he wrote many, many, many sonnets back in the late 16th, early 17th century. And so if you want to know about that form, definitely just get Shakespeare's, because they're sort of the end-all be-all for that form of poetry. And finally, we come to the limerick. Now, the limerick is the one that sort of has had the most infamous reputation, because for all of us who grew up in the 20th century, there was the dirty limerick, and it is named after a town in Ireland. I actually stayed there about 2 years ago, and it's kind of a strange place, but it's made up of 5 lines, and it has an AABBA rhyming construct. That's not ABBA. It's not Benny, Bourne, Aretha, and Agamemnon. I forget their names anyway. But it's not ABBA, it's AABBA. And probably the most famous limerick is "There once was a man from Nantucket who had a..." No, I won't say it. Just look it up. But limerick's a lot of fun. And needless to say, they're held very dearly by people of Celtic origin. So, but you can have your mind expanded online by looking up more about limericks. So definitely do so. And you did it. There it is, your crash course in poetry. So many different types, and the strange thing is, a lot of them have really, really similar overlaps. And so yeah, I invite you to go and check out the Poetry Writers Market if you're into that, so you can try to find a place for your poetry. Or if you just want to know more about it, look up each one and just sort of immerse yourself in the structure and the themes and the topics that they touch on. Lots of interesting stuff out there, and it's interesting to see not only how they exist within their own format, but how they influenced other forms of art that came afterwards. So get yourself out there and check them out. There's so many wondrous things about the mix of music and lyrics and poetry. I mean, it goes from everything from Greek mythology all the way up to rap music, which is a form of poetry in and of itself. But I invite you to check out all this because, like I said, it has had an enormous and far-reaching effect on art across the last 2,000 years. And it gives you a much clearer overview and understanding of art and the written arts. And I think it's fantastic to pick those things apart and really, really get into the meat of certain people that whose work that you really, really admire. But that's it for today. Thank you very much for joining me here in front of my bookcase. And I want you all to take care of yourselves. Bye. Okay, I've got my mask on. Now, Usually I use this spot in the credits to do something really funny, but given what's going on in the world right now, I'd actually like to do something a little bit more serious here. In the last month, we've had some immensely disturbing things happening across the world in the form of COVID-19. And at this point, 2 members of my extended family are in hospital because of it. And I definitely invite you to check in on loved ones, both young and old. After all, there may be only one person that checks in on someone a day who's in need, and that person could be you. So definitely do your part, wash your hands, use your head, and keep your distance. And by all means, definitely don't panic. We're going to get through this, and things are going to return to something approximating normal. I don't know if there's really a normal anymore, but we'll get back to something near it. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you again next time.